Okay, we welcome you all here this evening, and we welcome you again as we continue our series called 66 Books in 52 Weeks. Tonight we are up to the 26th book of the Bible, the book of Ezekiel. And it's the prophet Ezekiel. It's got 48 chapters in it. Let's just look at a little overview of what this book is. And first of all, we've got I'll zoom this in so you all can see at home. So the book of Ezekiel has 26, it's the 26th book of the Bible. It has 48 chapters in it. And he was a priest. He was one of the ones that was carried away into captivity. He prophesied for about 20 years. It has there just the time you can see where it was written and the period in which it was covered. And we'll cover that in a little more detail in just a moment here. Now, here is the way the Bible summary sheet outlines it here. It has 5 sections here that it divides it up into. So chapter 1 is Ezekiel's wheel. We'll explain that in a little bit. Chapter 2, 2 through 3 is Ezekiel's coronation as a voice from God, as a prophet, that is. And then the chapters 4 through 24 is God's expressing his anger and his judgment. And then 25 through 32 is judgment on the mockers. And again, there's some visions of the future in chapters 33 through 48. And so those are the 5 sections according to what we have seen on the Bible handouts that you can download or come in here and pick those up in person here. So let's continue here. We'll move along here. There is what would be a key verse. Again, it's hard to pick one verse that summarizes everything from any book, but I think this is one that would be a good key verse, as good as any, out of the book of Ezekiel. So it's Ezekiel chapter 36 and verse 26. I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. So here you see here that yes, there's a lot of pronouncements of judgments, there's a lot of warnings, but there is also this message of hope that is intertwined through all of the books of the prophets. So let's continue just talking about who Ezekiel was. Look at Ezekiel the man. All right, here's some facts about Ezekiel the man. He was deported to Babylon in 597 BC. So there were 3 groups of Jews that were taken into the Babylonian captivity. There was one that took place in 605 BC, one in 597, and then the last one would be in 586. Ezekiel was among the captives in 597 BC, and according to Ezekiel 1 verses 1 through 3, he was 25 at the time of his exile, and he received a call to prophecy at the age of 30. So he was called to be a prophet at that age, and I'll just read this to you here. In my 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day, while I was among the exiles in Kebar River, the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. On the 5th of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiakim. The word of the Lord came to Ezekiel the priest, the son of Buzi, by the Kebar River, in the land of the Babylonians. There the hand of the Lord was on him. So we see Ezekiel's primarily making a lot of his prophecies while in captivity and speaking to God's people there, but it was before and it was leading up to and during some of the captivity. Ezekiel came from a priestly family. Since there was no temple present, when they were in exile, he was the one who was called to declare God's word, display God's character among the people. And now there's another person that ministered in somewhat of this time, and that would have been Daniel. But Ezekiel's ministry was different than Daniel's, and we'll look at Daniel next week. And while Daniel was in an administrative position in Babylon's royal court, God made it so that Daniel could be in the leadership, around the leadership of the Babylonians. Ezekiel, his ministry was more in amongst the people of God. And so here's one of the key things about Ezekiel that's unique about him. And I chuckle about this, but his message was a very serious one. But Ezekiel's entire life was a message. I'll just put it this way. He was a human visual aid. So he dug through the wall of his house to picture Judah's exile. He told parables about vines and allegories of birth to picture God's care for his people. In a vision, he prophesied to some bones and made them alive, symbolizing new life for Judah and Israel. We'll talk about that. So his whole life was a message. Here's something else that happened. God made Ezekiel to become mute, except when he had a word from the Lord to declare. The muteness lasted for 7 years, ending when Jerusalem was destroyed, which confirmed the prophetic message. In Ezekiel 3:26 through 27, he says, I will make your tongue stick to the roof of your mouth, so that you will be silent and unable to rebuke them, for they are a rebellious people. But when I speak to you, I will open your mouth, and you shall say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Whoever will listen, let them listen, and whoever will refuse, let them refuse, for they are a rebellious people. Again, his whole life was an object lesson. Ezekiel lost his wife, but then was told by God not to mourn for her publicly, symbolizing God's desire for the exiles not to weep over the impending destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Let me just read to you Ezekiel 24:16. Son of man, with one blow I'm about to take away from you the delight of your eyes, yet do not lament or weep or shed any tears. And his actions was to be a message to the people there in Judah, or to the Jewish people. And throughout all of this, as difficult as it is, God had his hand on the prophet Ezekiel. And God used Ezekiel in a very special way to communicate and give encouragement to the exiles. And during the exile, they had no temple, no priestly structure, no sacrificial system in which God's glory could flow. All of those things we talked about in the history books back in the Old Testament. But Ezekiel was called to preach about holiness and hope in what would be one of the most desperate times of the people of God. So let's continue and think about some of the major themes that you will find in the book of Ezekiel here. So on your outline there, you'll see here that there was a strong emphasis on the sovereignty, glory, and the faithfulness of God. You see that over and over again, where there's horrible things going on, but then the prophet reminds the people, and the prophet is reminded of the sovereignty and the faithfulness of God. There is a concentration on the temple with its perversion, then its destruction, and then its restoration. So what's going to happen here to the temple when Jerusalem is conquered? Then you have a vivid portrayal of God's heavenly glory, God's departing glory, and God's earthly glory. We'll see this in the outline to come. And here is a key phrase here. More than 60 times, God said that he acted so that people would know that I am the Lord. God was making himself known to his people here. So let's just move along here, and we will go on through some of these, through the outline of Ezekiel, and hopefully you can follow along here. So what do we find out here? We've got a lot of chapters to hit through here, but we can make it through here. So first of all, we begin with a picture of the glory of the Lord. It was the glory of the Lord and a commission of the prophet. That's chapters 1 through 11. So what do we see in these chapters here? Chapter 1 is a display of the glory of the Lord. Now, as you read through this, you're going to see some striking features in this vision of Ezekiel 1. We'll read through some of this. As you read this, if you're familiar with the book of Revelation, a lot of it sounds like the book of Revelation, and also Daniel, when you read through it, a lot of it from chapter 7 on in Daniel, that language is very similar here. So here's some of the striking features in this vision here. You see, first of all, flashing light. A lot of times flashing light and this brightness is a symbol of God. Let me read to you here Ezekiel 1 and 4. 1 verse 4. I looked and I saw a windstorm coming out of the north, an immense cloud with flashing lightning and surrounded by brilliant light. The center of the fire looked like glowing metal. And then down in verses 13 and 14 of Ezekiel chapter 1, the appearance of the living creatures was like burning coals of fire, or like torches. Fire moved back and forth among the creatures. It was bright, and lightning flashed out of it. The creatures sped back and forth like flashes of lightning. So there's this fantastic vision that Ezekiel has, and its brightness. You see flashes of light in that. Another thing that you'll see is this idea of the glory of God. Look at Ezekiel 1 and verse 28. The glory of God, like the appearance of a rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day, so was the radiance around him. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. When I saw it, I fell face down, and I heard the voice of one speaking. You hear this glory of the Lord. It kind of reminds me of Peter, James, and John that go up on a mountain with Jesus one day. And all of a sudden, Jesus is transfigured before them. And suddenly, he's there in his glory. And next thing you know, they're on their knees worshiping. They're seeing him for as he really is. And so Ezekiel has this vision of God. And then the vision of the living creatures, or the cherubim. And so let me just read here. This is verses 5 through 12 of Ezekiel 1. And in the fire was what looked like 4 living creatures. In appearance, their form was human, but each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings. Their legs were straight, and their feet were like those of a calf, and gleamed like burnished bronze. Under their wings, on their 4 sides, they had human hands. All 4 of them had faces and wings, and the wings of the one touched the wings of another. Each one went straight ahead, and they did not turn as they moved. Their faces looked like this. Each of the 4 had the face of a human being, and on the right side, each had the face of a lion, and on the left, the face of an ox, and each also had the face of an eagle. Such were their faces. They each had 2 wings spreading out upwards, each wing touching that of the creature on either side, and each had their 2 wings covering its body. Each one went straight ahead. Wherever the Spirit would go, they would go without turning as they went. So I can't claim to explain all of this, but we can see there's this heavenly vision that Ezekiel sees, and it's just impressive and overwhelming is what he's seeing. So then you have the vision of the wheels. So apparently, from my understanding here, this is apparently a picture of the ceaseless activity and energy of God's divine powers. This wheel, God's always working, and that's kind of what it's a symbol of, God moving forward in his providence. So in Ezekiel 1, beginning in verse 15, it says this, I looked at the living creatures, and I saw a wheel on the ground beside each creature with its 4 faces. This was the appearance and the structure of the wheels. They sparkled like topaz, and all 4 looked alike. Each appeared to be made like a wheel intersecting a wheel. Some of you might remember there was an old gospel song, Ezekiel saw the wheel way up in the middle of the air, and that's where you get these visions of Ezekiel. There's another gospel song from Ezekiel that we'll talk about here in just a little bit here. So then you have this idea of the 4 faces here. Let me skip back here. With these creatures and things, along with that, you have the intelligent purpose. It was the face of a man and eyes, appearance of a man. It's terms ascribing to God bodily attributes. It's not just, so what we're getting here is that this is not just the force, like from Star Wars speaking to Ezekiel. This is a personal being, divine being speaking to Ezekiel. And so this whole scene is being orchestrated in front of him, and it had to have just been overwhelming. How he even wrote all of this down had to have been by divine help. Then we have the four faces. So let me just read this again. Ezekiel chapter 1 and verse 10. Their faces looked like this. Each of the four had the face of a human being, and on the right side of each had the face of a lion, on the left side the face of an ox, and also had the face of an eagle. What in the world does all of this mean? Well, I'm not going to sit here and explain or pretend that I understand all of this. I know this was just a vision of heaven. However, some say that this could represent the way that Jesus is portrayed in the four Gospels. Now, I want to be careful about this because sometimes you can over-speculate on these things. But I thought this was interesting. So, you think about the four Gospels, all right? So, the kingship symbolized by the lion, and the Gospel of Matthew focuses on the kingship of Christ. And then you have a servant symbolized by the ox. Well, the Gospel of Mark focuses on Jesus as being a servant in some ways, coming to serve. His perfect humanity is symbolized by the face of a man. And Luke, a lot of times that gospel kind of focuses on the humanity of Jesus. Interesting that the longest account of his birth is found in Luke, the humanity of Jesus. But then you have the deity or the godness of Jesus, symbolized by the flying eagle, and the Gospel of John focuses on more of the Jesus is God. So now again, this could be some speculation, sanctified speculation, but it's just kind of fun to think about that. Perhaps this could be an echo of something greater to come in the gospel. I'm not saying that this is definitive, but you get this and you have this idea. And sometimes when you read things like this, what I found is helpful, especially like in the book of Revelation, when you're reading these prophecies, instead of asking what's on the page exactly, ask yourself, how is this making me feel? For me, this makes me feel like I'm in awe. I'm taken to the throne room of heaven with Ezekiel, and I am, like Ezekiel, I'm in awe of what I'm witnessing there. So, we've got so then that brings us on to the next one here. We have Ezekiel's call and empowerment. That's Ezekiel chapter 2. Now, just like all prophets, Ezekiel is empowered by the Holy Spirit. He's told that he will speak, and he's also told that he's not going to be heard. Any other prophets fit that description? They've got a message they're going to speak, and nobody's going to listen to them. I've heard about every one of them. So Ezekiel 2, beginning in verse 1, he said to me, Son of man, stand up on your feet, and I will speak to you. As he spoke, the Spirit came into me and raised me to my feet, and I heard him speaking to me. He said, Son of man, I am sending you to the Israelites, to a rebellious nation that have rebelled against me. They and their ancestors have been in revolt against me to this very day. So that's Ezekiel chapter 2. Then we come on to Ezekiel chapter 3, and this is the picture of the scroll and the watchman. So in a vision here, this is where the prophet is told to eat a scroll. Something similar happens in the book of Revelation. In Revelation, John's told to eat a scroll, and it was sweet to the taste, but it was sour in the stomach. So in a similar way here, Ezekiel is told to eat a scroll representing the message of God. Take this into you here, and you will tell it out. And then God tells Ezekiel that he is fulfilling the role of a watchman. A watchman is a person that looks out and sees a warning, gives a warning to people there. So the scroll and the watchman. Then this is where it gets a little interesting in his communication methods. Sometimes people have some very interesting communication methods when they speak. Ezekiel definitely did. God instructs Ezekiel in Ezekiel chapter 4 to attack a brick. So he had a brick and attacked it. The prophet lies for 390 days on his left side in each defiled bread, which was a symbol of the Israelites continuing to sin. And then the prophet lies for 40 days on his right side, depicting the coming siege of Jerusalem. So he's talking about these things here. It's what's going to happen, that Jerusalem is eventually going to be destroyed. So that was quite a dramatic way to communicate the message of God. So the next part here, Ezekiel chapter 5. Trying to get the message across again, Ezekiel shaves his head. So what does he do? He shaves his hair, he shaves his beard, then he divides the hair into 3 parts, depicting the 3 judgments of Jerusalem. We talked about the 3 times that Jerusalem is, exiles are brought out, and Ezekiel is one of those groups that were brought out of Jerusalem until eventually Jerusalem is destroyed. So you can see here just some interesting ways that Ezekiel was told to communicate. Ezekiel chapter 6, a sword was to fall upon Jerusalem. And so Ezekiel predicts that the sword would come against Jerusalem. However, a remnant will be saved. Let me read to you Ezekiel chapter 6 and verse 8. It says, "But I will spare some, for some of you will escape the sword when you are scattered among the lands and nations." And then we get to Ezekiel chapter 7, which is the final destruction of Jerusalem that is predicted in Ezekiel chapter 7. So, interesting ways to communicate, but he has some more interesting ways to communicate even after this. So, now we have in Ezekiel chapters 8 through 24, the idea is that it's the focus on the glory of the Lord, the captivity of Jerusalem, and then the departure of the glory of the Lord. And we're focusing on the temple, because the glory of the Lord would settle onto the temple in Jerusalem, and how that was going to be leaving because of the sin of the people of Judah. So Ezekiel chapter 8 focuses in on the defilement of the temple. All these prophets, isn't it interesting? All these prophets list out all the sins. Here's what you're doing, people, and here's what's going to happen, making it very clear. And so this chapter begins with a vision of the glory of the Lord, then an exposure of the idolatry that is practiced in the temple. Not only are they worshiping the Baals and different idols and stuff around in the high places, they are doing this in the temple itself. Therefore, God is going to destroy it. And so chapter 9 is a record of God preparing to leave the temple. So remember, this is where the glory of God would come down and dwell inside the temple, and that is where the glory of God was. Now, the Spirit of God now dwells and lives within our bodily temples as Christians, but in this time, he dwelt in there. And so here is the glory of God preparing to leave the temple. Let me read to you from Ezekiel 9, beginning in verse 9. He answered me, "The sin of the people of Israel and Judah is exceedingly great. The land is full of bloodshed. The city is full of injustice. They say the Lord has forsaken the land. The Lord does not see." So again, this is the glory of God preparing to leave the temple. And then in verse 10 is when it happens. The glory of God leaves the temple. Ezekiel sees this idea of God leaving the temple in Jerusalem one last time, and then God's glory fills the temple one last time and then departs. So this is a sad chapter here. This is, but Ezekiel is spelling it out there, and that brings us again to some more prophecies here. Here's some prophecies against the rulers in Jerusalem in Ezekiel 11. So here, under God's instruction, Ezekiel calls out the leaders in Jerusalem for their sin. He pronounces judgment, but at the same time, God offers a ray of hope in light of the coming exile. Ezekiel 11 says, therefore say this is, Ezekiel 11 and verse 17. Therefore say, this is what the sovereign Lord says, I will gather you from the nations and bring you back from the countries where you have been scattered, and I will give you back the land of Israel again. And so that eventually was fulfilled in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezekiel 11:17 was fulfilled in that day. So, you want some more interesting preaching methods here? Here we go. Ezekiel chapter 12. Ezekiel enacts the destruction of Jerusalem. So then, to enact this happening, Ezekiel locks himself in his house. He digs through the wall and takes his possessions out through the excavation. And so this is an object lesson depicting the captivity of Jerusalem. So he does this to make a scene, to make people see this is what's going to happen, and this is how he communicated. I just find this fascinating here. So now we come to chapter 13, which is where we have the false prophets being condemned. And so in this chapter you have false prophets, male and female. They are predicting peace in the midst of great evil. They're calling good bad and wrong right and all of those types of things. But God condemns them for not speaking the truth, and Ezekiel calls all of this out in chapter 13. And then in chapter 14, all of those practicing idolatry are condemned and they are warned. Ezekiel is that watchman standing on the wall giving ample warning. And then there is an interesting illustration here. Jerusalem in chapter 15 is depicted as a useless vine. And so it's a dead vine that can't grow grapes anymore, but it's a dead vine that's not even good for use for lumber. You can't use a grapevine to build a house, maybe a really curvy house. So it just must be destroyed after this. And then we see here Jerusalem is then compared to an abandoned baby that had been adopted by God. So here's the idea. God had adopted the people of Israel, the Jewish people, and showed them kindness, but what did they do in return? They still rebelled. So this is the general message here. Again, we're at 1,000 feet over, flying over the book. So this is the general message you're going to get here. So then you have the riddle of the two eagles and the vine. And so Ezekiel uses an illustration involving two eagles and a vine to represent rebellion and the judgment of Israel. The idea is that Israel will be uprooted, like an eagle will come down and take off the branches and uproot the nation of Israel. And so you can see that or in chapter 17. And then Ezekiel talks about the high cost of sin, which is death. That might remind you of a verse in Romans, for the wages of sin is death, but the free gift of God is eternal life through Christ. But here in Ezekiel chapter 18 and verse 4, it says, the one who sins is the one who will die. That was true since the beginning of creation. Adam and Eve, the day you eat this fruit, you will surely die. Death enters in when sin enters in. And then Ezekiel 18 and verse 9, he follows my decrees and faithfully keeps my laws. That man is righteous. He will surely live, declares the sovereign Lord. And so the idea is there's this choice of following God or not following God, and there is a high cost to choosing sin over the Lord. And then chapter 19, we saw the book of Lamentations just last week, and this was a lament, is deep sorrow. And so Ezekiel here expresses great sorrow over the princes of Israel and those and how they had turned away from God, and it's just a lament in chapter 19. And then again, it's a review in chapter 20 of Israel's long history of sins, but with some hope thrown in there. Can you see a pattern in what these prophets are doing? They spell it out. I mean, there is no way you could not understand what the problem is. And there's also no way you could not see that there is hope if you come to God. And so Israel's pattern of rebellion is clearly listed out. Of here's what you've done, here's your pattern, look at your pattern, here's what's going on. But then God predicts finally a future restoration. There's hope. I had a preaching professor who said this: whenever you preach a hard sermon, try to always offer a Band-Aid. Give some hope and give some comfort in it. Don't just, if you preach something that's harsh or a hard truth, try to put a Band-Aid on there. God offers hope in the midst of these fiercely, these fierce, intense passages about God's justice and wrath. So, then you have the king of Babylon is to remove the last king from David's line until the Messiah comes. So remember, the southern kingdom, all of those kings were from the line of David. And so when Babylon came in and took out the king and exiled them, then there wasn't a king in Israel. That was the last king until the return, until Jesus comes on the scene and is born. So Ezekiel 21, verse 27 says, a ruin, I will make it a ruin. The crown will not be restored until he whom it rightfully belongs shall come. To him I will give it. He's referring to Jesus. This is a messianic prophecy. So, not to get bogged down on this, but once again, another review of Jerusalem's sins in Ezekiel 22. I think sometimes you read through these, sometimes people say, boy, that just seems so repetitive, And again, this is a message over many years that he's sharing this. And again, this shows again that the people of Israel, the people of God, they had no excuse. They had every opportunity to turn back. God was begging them. Then in chapter 23, you had the parable of the two sisters. Okay, if you're not going to listen to me attacking a brick or digging a hole through my house, here's another story here, and it's the two sisters, and they represent the north and the southern kingdoms, and the parable is that you have both of them committed spiritual adultery. So Ezekiel is pointing that out. And then we have another parable, the parable of the boiling pot. So what does this mean here? Well, let me just put it this way. The main point, the boiling pot, is Jerusalem's goose is cooked. All right? So that's a very deep theological way of explaining that there, okay? Now, this is the tragic chapter here where Ezekiel's wife dies, and he is not allowed to mourn her death publicly. So don't weep. You've had this warning, don't weep over Jerusalem here. So, a lot of good messages here, right?
Why can't he weep?
He's not allowed to weep because he had, it was a way because then he's supposed to make the message to the people of God, don't weep over Jerusalem. You've been giving these warnings. I'm not weeping over my wife. You don't weep over the temple and over Jerusalem, over that type of thing. So, the next part of this, we have the glory of the Lord and the judgment of the nations. See another pattern here? Not only do the prophets speak for God and about the judgment of Israel, but he also talks about God is watching all nations here. So in this section here, the Lord pronounces his coming judgment upon Tyre, Sidon, Egypt, and places like this. So in Ezekiel 28, this here is a pretty famous passage here in chapter 28, verses 12 through 19. This is an interesting description of the devil here. So let me just read this here. You were the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone adorned you, carnelian, chrysolite, and emerald, and topaz, onyx, and jasper, lapis, and jazzile, turquoise, and beryl. Your settings and your mountings were made of gold. On the day you were created, they were prepared. You were anointed as a guardian cherub, for so I ordained you. You were on the holy mount of God. You walked among the fiery stones. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created till wickedness was found in you. Through your widespread trade, you were filled with violence and you sinned. So I drove you in disgrace from the mount of God, and I expelled you, guardian cherub, from among the fiery stones. Your heart became proud on account of your beauty, and you corrupted your wisdom because of your splendor. So I threw you to earth. I made a spectacle of you before kings. By your many sins and dishonest trade, you have desecrated your sanctuary. So I made a fire come out from you, and it consumed you, and I reduced you to ashes on the ground in the sight of all who were watching. All the nations who knew you are appalled at you and have come to a horrible end and will be no more. So this is an interesting description, not only of the origin of the devil, but also the ultimate end of the devil here. So very famous passage that you may have heard before. And it's a very interesting description here. So then the next part here, we have the glory of the Lord and the coming kingdom here. This is chapters 33 through 48. Now we have another one here. This is where we get our second gospel song from that you might be familiar with. You know, the leg bone connects to the knee bone connects to the thigh bone. Now hear the word of the Lord. This chapter is what that song is based on here. It's the vision of the valley of dry bones. So here's that vision. Ezekiel goes out and sees this valley of dry bones. No hope in there. And then there's this amazing thing where suddenly these bones came together, they gained flesh, and all of a sudden they became together, they came to life, became fully alive, and became a mighty army there. And so Israel, the idea is the Israelites, they would look and think, okay, there's no hope. We're in exile. We're just a bunch of dry bones. But even God can breathe life into old, dead, dry bones. So maybe you can look up that song tonight and listen to that. And so that is what that is about, where you always sing that. It's a gospel song based on Ezekiel chapter 37. Now, here's another one here. If you want to get into all kinds of discussions and arguments over prophecy, the repudiation of Gog and Magog. Boy, this is a mysterious group here. And what's this all about here? These chapters describe Gog and Magog, and they are a mysterious northern force of evil. That's what we will call it here. And as the way I understand it here, Gog is actually the leader of the land of Magog. But most see this as having a double fulfillment. Number one, invaders from the north attacking Israel near Ezekiel's time. And two, a picture of a world war near the end of times. Some have even said that this is a prophecy of Russia. So, and again, I'm not going to speak authoritatively on these things, but this is what is said of this. Now, here's what's important to understand. The north in that time, we got trouble coming from the north. If you heard that, that was generally seen as a harbinger of doom. Something bad's coming from the north. It's not good. So when you hear that and that Gog and Magog, that's the idea is the same. It's an enemy from the north. It's something that's not good. It's the sinister, supernatural north. So it's picture in your mind. Just picture that. So let me just read this to you. Ezekiel 38, beginning in verse 21. It says, I will summon a sword against Gog on all my mountains, declares the sovereign Lord. Every man's sword will be against his brother. I will execute judgment on him with plague and bloodshed. I will pour down torrents of rain, hailstorms, and burning sulfur on him and his troops and on the many nations with him. And so I will show my greatness and my holiness, and I will make myself known in the sight of many nations. Then they will know that I am the Lord. So, lot of theories on specifics of what this means, but we would say there's a general lesson. God will ultimately prevail against all enemies, no matter how imposing. So when the enemy from the north comes, or if you want to call it Gog and Magog, I don't know if you can think of something that sounds intimidating in your life, one day God will prevail over that. And so Gog and Magog, those terms, you'll see those terms again in Revelation. And so when I see those terms, I just put in my mind, I just think intimidating evil force. That's just what I think in my mind, just in a general term, instead of trying to assign a specific nation to it. Now, maybe there would be, but this is the main lesson here. No matter how intimidating the enemies of God are, God will prevail eventually. So, now we come back here to the prediction of the rebuilding of the temple. That's Ezekiel 40 through 42. This would be fulfilled in the day of Ezra and Nehemiah. And in previous weeks, we have gone through those books, Ezra and Nehemiah. And then finally, in the last chapters there, chapters 43 through 48, we have the return of the glory of the Lord back into the temple. So it starts with a fanciful vision. You see horrific scenes of judgment, and then you end with a message of hope. Isn't it interesting? Fast forward all the way to the book of Revelation. Starts with this fanciful vision, amazing vision. Throughout the middle of it, you have these scenes of horrendous judgment and horrendous wars and battles. And then at the end, there's this amazing hope at the end of Revelation. There is a pattern here if you kind of step back and look at the big picture. And so the final phrase of this book is the thing that gives real hope. And the final phrase of the book is this: and the name of the city from this time will be, the Lord is there. Ezekiel 48:35, the last phrase. Isn't that a symbol of hope? You know, the book of Revelation closes with this vision of a city. And it says, and so shall we ever be with the Lord forever. You know, those, so that you've got that general idea, that general pattern here. So, what do we learn from all this? Do you feel like you're an expert on the book of Ezekiel tonight? I hope that you do. There's a lot to go. So, we're getting really smart here. So, let's just go through a few applications. I've gone through the chapter by chapter, and we've just kind of looked at what happened. But it's good to read all of those things, but it's also important to understand the big picture and the big lessons. So, on your outline there, if you want to write this down, God is patient, but will ultimately bring justice. How long did each of these prophets preach? Holding out, waiting and waiting and waiting, preaching again and again and again, but eventually God's justice will be seen. The other thing is, God goes out of his way to get his message across. Think of all the crazy things that Ezekiel did. He attacked a brick. He dug a hole through his house. He laid on his side for 390 days and then for another 40 days. God was trying to get his people's attention. God went out of his way to get the message across, but not just through Ezekiel, through all of these prophets, speaking time and time again. There was a time when Jeremiah carried this giant yoke around. You know, we didn't mention that in that study. God was trying to get their attention. Look at me, look at this. You know, and it's kind of taking them by the shoulders and trying to shake them, and God goes out of his way to get his message across. Well, apparently he did. The question is, did all those people know he was laying on one side and then the other? Apparently he did this in a public fashion so that it could be seen. So, and the word would get around. And so certainly you'd say, well, hey, did you see that guy laying on the side? So the message would get across there. So, Well, lay there for 390 days. So you just think of that, how God goes out of his way to get his message across. But the ultimate way that God went out of his way to get his message across was that when the time had fully come, God sent his son, Jesus Christ, to be born of a woman. And here we have him, God going out of his way, taking on flesh, born of the Virgin Mary, taking on flesh to get his message across. Of course, this is in the New Testament here. So now finally here, and this might be something that you'll hear a number of times as we go through the prophets. Prophecies sometimes have multiple fulfillments. They might be fulfilled, in other words, some of Ezekiel's prophecies could apply to the eventual return of the Jews to Jerusalem, but they could also apply to the end times and both be correct. Sometimes a prophet will make a prediction, there will be a prophecy, and it will have multiple fulfillments. So I hope this makes some sense to you here. And this is a good little summary, hopefully, of the book of Ezekiel here.